A couple arrived at the gate for what should have been a routine flight, but within minutes, they found themselves accused, humiliated, and denied their seats. Unbeknownst to the flight attendant, every move was under scrutiny, and the drama about to unfold would soon send ripples throughout the airline. Before we dive into the details, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit subscribe. On what appeared to be an ordinary day, the airport hummed with its usual rhythm. Travelers navigated the check-in process with quiet determination, some lost in the glow of their phone screens, sending last-minute texts, others savoring a brief pause with a cup of coffee before their next journey. Near Gate 12, a flight attendant stood poised by the boarding pass scanner, her gaze sharp and methodical as she monitored the steadily arriving crowd. Her presence exuded a formal authority that unsettled a few, hinting at an uncompromising adherence to protocol. Amid the ebb and flow of passengers, a couple made their way toward the gate, engaged in a soft, intimate conversation. Dressed in smart, casual attire and each carrying a sleek carry-on, they moved with a measured confidence that was both unassuming and intriguing. The man casually checked his watch, while the woman discreetly scanned their surroundings, as if safeguarding a secret. Their quiet composure, so effortlessly natural, inadvertently caught the flight attendant's attention, sparking a subtle but unmistakable flicker of doubt. As they reached the front of the line, the flight attendant held up her hand. "I'll need to see your boarding passes," she said firmly. The couple exchanged a brief look, but complied without hesitation. The man handed over the 2 tickets, his smile polite but reserved. She examined them closely, her brows knitting together, as her eyes flicked back and forth between the tickets and the passengers in front of her. "These are for first class," she stated, her tone flat but edged with skepticism. The man nodded. "That's correct," he said simply, his tone steady, but there was a hint of surprise at the question. The woman stood quietly beside him, her expression calm but alert. The flight attendant's frown deepened. "I'll need a moment to verify this," she said, turning away without waiting for a response. With purposeful strides, she headed to the podium, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor as she tapped on the computer. Around her, passengers shifted uneasily. Some craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the unfolding commotion. The couple, however, stood resolute, their composed expressions unbroken, though the woman's hand tightened slightly on her bag, betraying a hint of apprehension. When the flight attendant returned, her face was an unreadable mask. "There seems to be an issue with your seats," she said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of those nearby. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to step aside while we sort this out." The man tilted his head slightly, his polite smile fading into a quiet concern. "What kind of issue?" he asked, his tone calm yet carrying a firmer edge. The flight attendant hesitated briefly, glancing at the growing line of impatient onlookers. "It looks like there's been a mix-up," she said vaguely. "I'll need you to wait over there while I check with my supervisor." As the woman began to speak, the man gently placed a hand on her arm, halting her words. "We'll wait," he stated, his gaze fixed steadily on the flight attendant as they stepped aside. Around them, the murmurs of curious passengers grew into a low hum of whispers. Some averted their eyes in feigned indifference, while others openly watched the scene unfold, their faces a blend of intrigue and discomfort. The flight attendant, now with her phone in hand, spoke in low, measured tones, occasionally glancing over at the couple. The atmosphere grew tense with every passing moment. In a hushed exchange, the woman leaned toward the man and whispered something only he could hear. He nodded, and both straightened up, their expressions shifting subtly to one of quiet resolve. As the minutes stretched on, Several passengers discreetly began recording the incident on their phones, each capturing the charged ambiance. Soon, another airline employee emerged, striding purposefully toward the gate. Her neutral expression and brisk pace revealed that she was well acquainted with such disruptions. This seasoned supervisor approached the flight attendant, who promptly handed over the couple's boarding passes without hesitation. In a brief yet pointed exchange, filled with hushed remarks and deliberate gestures referring to the couple, the situation escalated. The supervisor listened intently, her face giving nothing away as she observed the couple from a distance. Then, without a word, she turned and approached them. "I'm the supervisor for this flight," she said politely, extending a hand. "I understand there's been some confusion about your seats." The man accepted her handshake, his grip firm but polite. "There shouldn't be any confusion," he replied. "We booked these seats weeks ago. They're in first class, and they were confirmed. What seems to be the problem?" The supervisor studied him for a moment, her professional smile never wavering as she assessed every detail with quiet precision. "Let me double-check this system," she said. "I'll resolve this as quickly as possible." She gestured toward a small seating area nearby, inviting them to wait. "Please, have a seat while I sort this out." For a heartbeat, the couple hesitated, a subtle pause that spoke of uncertainty, before they moved to the seating area. As they settled, the woman leaned close to the man, whispering something only meant for his ear. He responded with a slight nod, his expression remaining calm and inscrutable. All around them, curious onlookers kept a discreet vigil, with some openly recording the unfolding scene. Gradually, murmurs swelled among the passengers as they speculated about the delay and the possible mishap. Meanwhile, at the podium, the supervisor's fingers danced over the keyboard, her focus unwavering as she delved deep into the system's data. Beside her, the flight attendant hovered with crossed arms and a tense posture. "I'm telling you, something about this doesn't feel right," the attendant said quietly, her tone defensive. "I've seen situations like this before. It's better to be cautious." The supervisor remained silent for a moment, her eyes locked on the screen in a silent battle of data versus instinct. Then, breaking the tension, she spoke with measured confidence. "Their tickets are valid, first class is not overbooked, there's no reason they shouldn't board." The flight attendant's jaw tightened perceptibly at the confirmation. "Are you sure? Did you check?" "I've checked everything," the supervisor interrupted, her voice firm. "Now, there's no issue with their booking." Turning her attention to the attendant, her gaze sharpened as she demanded clarity. "What exactly made you stop them?" The flight attendant hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words in the charged silence. I just had a feeling," she finally admitted in a quieter voice. Now, something didn't add up. The supervisor fixed her with a piercing stare, the weight of unspoken accountability hanging heavily between them. After a moment of palpable stillness, she shook her head and declared, "Feelings aren't a policy," she said coldly. "We're not here to make judgment calls based on personal instincts. Fix this now." The flight attendant stiffened, her face flushing in response, but before she could respond, the supervisor had already turned back to the couple. The supervisor approached the couple again, her expression softer this time, but still professional. "I want to apologize for the inconvenience," she began. "Your tickets are valid, and you're cleared to board. Please follow me." In that moment, an air of cautious relief mixed with lingering tension filled the space. The couple exchanged a brief, understanding look, one that spoke of shared exasperation and silent resilience. As the man stood and gathered his bag with a calm determination, the woman trailed closely behind. Her poised exterior belied the subtle tension in the way she clutched her bag a little tighter. Together, they followed the supervisor's steady lead toward the gate, leaving behind the unsettled flight attendant who lingered in the background, her features a canvas of mounting frustration and unease. As they neared the boarding area, the supervisor glanced back, offering a warm, reassuring smile that momentarily softened the strain of the ordeal. "We'll make sure your experience is smooth from here on out," she said quietly. The woman nodded in return. Though her face remained composed, the sharp glint in her eyes hinted that the events of the moment were not so easily forgotten. Once the couple had vanished into the bustling jet bridge, the supervisor's demeanor shifted decisively. With a curt command, she addressed the flight attendant, "Come with me." There was no room for hesitation. The two walked briskly toward a secluded space behind the gate desk, leaving behind the curious murmur of passengers and the unsettled energy that had briefly gripped the crowd. The flight attendant's reluctant, stiff steps betrayed her inner turmoil as she followed. Away from prying ears, the supervisor's tone turned incisive as she confronted the flight attendant. "What exactly were you thinking?" she demanded, her voice low but firm. The flight attendant's eyes darted downward as she stammered, "I told you," before she managed to add defensively, "I had a feeling something wasn't right." The supervisor's incredulous response cut through the tense silence. "A feeling?" she repeated. "You held up boarding because of a feeling? Do you understand the implications of what you've just done?" Before the flight attendant could muster a proper reply, the sharp ring of the gate phone sliced through the exchange. The supervisor swiftly answered, her expression shifting into one of brisk professionalism as she listened and responded in clipped tones. "Yes, understood. I'll take care of it immediately." After ending the call, she turned back, her face now a mask of pale determination. "That was the executive office," she announced in an icy tone. "They've already received complaints about this incident, and there's footage circulating online. You're being reported for discrimination." The flight attendant froze, her face draining of color as the word discrimination hung in the air. "Discrimination?" she repeated, her voice rising. "I wasn't—" "It doesn't matter what you think you were doing," the supervisor snapped. "What matters is how it looks. And right now, it looks bad, very bad. Someone from corporate will be contacting you, and I suggest you think very carefully about what you're going to say." Before the flight attendant could gather her thoughts to respond, the supervisor turned and walked away, leaving her isolated at the gate. Curious glances from boarding passengers continued to pierce the space, leaving the flight attendant feeling more exposed than ever. Somewhere in the back of her mind, the realization began to set in. This wasn't going to be a minor incident. It was much bigger than she'd anticipated. The hum of the boarding area quieted as the last few passengers made their way onto the plane. The flight attendant stood by the gate desk, staring blankly at the computer screen. Her hands trembled slightly as she pretended to busy herself with routine tasks. In reality, her mind was racing. The mention of discrimination and the call from the executive office had shaken her confidence, leaving her unsure of what was coming next. Inside the plane, the couple settled into their first-class seats. The man leaned back, adjusting his tie, while the woman placed her bag carefully under the seat in front of her. Around them, other passengers seemed uneasy, many still sneaking glances in their direction. The tension in the air was palpable, even though the flight crew moved efficiently through their pre-flight checks. The couple said nothing. Their composure remained unbroken despite the drama they had just endured. Back at the gate, the flight attendant was startled by the sound of her name being called. She turned to see the supervisor approaching her again, this time accompanied by a man in a suit. He carried a clipboard and wore a badge that indicated he was from the corporate office. Her heart sank as he introduced himself. "We've been briefed on what happened here," he said, his tone professional but firm. "We need to have a word with you immediately." The supervisor gestured toward a small conference room near the gate, and the three of them walked inside. Once the door closed, the man in the suit wasted no time. "I've reviewed the initial reports and spoken with witnesses," he began. "It's clear that this situation could have been handled much differently." The flight attendant opened her mouth to respond, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Right now, the focus isn't on justifying what happened. The focus is on understanding why it happened." "I was just following protocol," the flight attendant said quickly. "I thought there might be an issue with their tickets, so I did." "You verified their tickets were invalid before stopping them?" The man interrupted. The flight attendant hesitated, her throat dry. "No, but..." "And did they show any signs of being disruptive or violating airline policies?" "No," she admitted reluctantly. "Then what exactly made you stop them?" His voice was calm but carried an edge that made her squirm. The flight attendant stammered, struggling to find the right words. "It just didn't feel right," she said finally, her voice barely audible. The man leaned forward, his expression sharp. "Let me make this clear. Personal feelings are not grounds for denying service. Your actions today not only delayed the boarding process, but created a situation that reflects poorly on this airline. Passengers are already posting about it online, and it's gaining traction fast. This is a serious issue." The flight attendant felt her stomach drop. She tried to respond, but no words came. The weight of his words was sinking in. And for the first time, she began to realize the full scope of her actions. The man stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "You're being placed on immediate suspension pending an investigation. You'll be contacted with further instructions." As he and the supervisor exited the room, the flight attendant remained seated, staring at the table in front of her. The reality of the situation was hitting her hard. This wasn't just about one decision. It was about everything that decision represented. And now she would have to face the consequences. The flight attendant sat in the small conference room, her head in her hands. The sounds of the bustling air report beyond the door felt distant, almost muted. She replayed the events in her mind, trying to understand how everything had spiraled so quickly. Her feeling had seemed valid at the time, but now it was being dissected by her superiors and the public, leaving her defenseless. Meanwhile, on board the flight, the couple remained quiet. The woman flipped through a magazine while the man typed on his laptop, both giving off an air of calm indifference. Yet, to anyone watching closely, it was clear they weren't ignoring the incident. They were processing it. The flight attendant assigned to first class approached with a cautious smile. "Is there anything I can get you before takeoff?" she asked politely. The man shook his head. "We're fine, thank you," he said, his tone steady. The woman offered a polite nod but said nothing. The flight attendant hesitated, sensing the tension, but eventually stepped away to tend to other passengers around them. Whispers and stolen glances continued. The couple remained composed, but the weight of the earlier confrontation hung in the air. Back at the gate, the supervisor returned to her desk, her face tight with frustration. She was scrolling through her tablet, reading updates about the situation. The corporate representative had already left, but the damage was still unfolding. Social media posts from passengers were spreading rapidly, some even tagging the airline's official account. Comments poured in, many criticizing the flight attendant's behavior and calling for accountability. The supervisor let out a heavy sigh. She had seen incidents escalate before, but this one was different. The couple's calm composure and the presence of witnesses made the flight attendant's actions difficult to defend, and worse, the corporate office was now involved, and the airline's reputation was at stake. Inside the plane, the flight crew was preparing for departure. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing that the flight would leave on time as the engines began to hum. The couple exchanged a brief glance. The man leaned toward the woman and whispered something. She nodded, her expression unreadable, before turning back to her magazine. As the plane taxied to the runway, the tension from the gate incident seemed to linger like an unspoken current running through the cabin. Passengers who had witnessed the scene earlier glanced at the couple, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. The couple, however, appeared unmoved. Their calm demeanor remained unbroken. For the flight attendant back at the gate, the weight of her suspension was sinking in. She sat alone, waiting for further instructions, her thoughts spiraling. She knew the incident had been recorded, and she could already imagine the fallout. What she didn't know was how quickly the consequences were about to escalate, and how much her life was about to change. The plane took off smoothly, climbing into the sky. As the passengers settled into their seats, the hum of the engines and the gentle shake of turbulence filled the cabin. The couple in first class remained quiet, maintaining their composed demeanor, but their expressions hinted at unspoken thoughts. The woman adjusted her scarf and glanced out of the window, while the man shut his laptop and leaned back in his seat. Their calm presence stood in stark contrast to the whispers still circulating among the other passengers. A passenger seated across the aisle leaned forward slightly. "Excuse me," he said in a low voice, careful not to draw attention. "I saw what happened at the gate. Are you two okay?" The man turned his head, offering a polite but firm smile. "We're fine, thank you," he said. The woman nodded in agreement, her expression soft but guarded. Sensing their unwillingness to elaborate, the passenger sat back, though his curiosity clearly lingered. As the flight progressed, the couple's calm was more strategic than it seemed. The man discreetly pulled out his phone, tapping on the screen before handing it to the woman. She glanced at the message he'd written, her lips pressing together slightly before nodding without a word. He sent it. They knew this wasn't just about their experience, it was about addressing something bigger. Their actions were deliberate, every move calculated as though they were steps in a game they intended to win. Meanwhile, back at the airport, the situation was unraveling faster than anyone had anticipated. The corporate representative who had met with the flight attendant earlier was now back in his office, coordinating damage control with the airline's executive team. Social media had erupted with posts from witnesses who had been at the gate. Some described the interaction in detail, highlighting the calm professionalism of the couple and the flight attendant's dismissive tone. Others posted videos which were quickly going viral. One clip in particular showed the flight attendant questioning the validity of the couple's tickets, her tone sharp and condescending, while the couple responded politely but firmly. The comments were overwhelmingly critical, accusing the airline of discrimination and calling for immediate action. The CEO of the airline, James Whitman, had already been alerted. Sitting in his sleek modern office, he watched the videos with a grim expression. "This is unacceptable," he muttered to himself. He picked up the phone and called his assistant. "Get me the supervisor from gate 12, he instructed. "I want a full report on this incident, and I want it now." Back at the airport, the supervisor was still at her desk when her phone rang. She answered quickly, her voice steady despite the growing pressure. The conversation with the CEO was brief and direct. When she hung up, she turned to her tablet, pulling up all the details she could find about the flight attendant involved, the passengers, and the timeline of events. She knew that whatever action the CEO decided to take would be swift and decisive. Inside the small conference room where the flight attendant had been sent to wait, the atmosphere was suffocating. She sat with her arms crossed tightly, staring at the blank wall in front of her. Her phone buzzed on the table, but she ignored it, unwilling to face the flood of notifications and messages she knew would be there. She was beginning to realize the enormity of her mistake. What she had dismissed as a minor misunderstanding was rapidly snowballing into a public relations disaster for the airline, and she was at the center of it. Finally, the door to the conference room opened and the supervisor walked in, her face set in a tense expression. She closed the door behind her and sat down across from the flight attendant, folding her hands on the table. "You need to understand how serious this is," the supervisor began, her tone low but firm. "The executive office is involved and the CEO himself has taken an interest in the situation." The flight attendant swallowed hard. "I didn't mean for it to escalate," she said, her voice shaky. "You thought wrong," the supervisor interrupted. "Whatever you were thinking, it wasn't based on policy or procedure. You acted on instinct, and now we're facing public backlash because of it." The flight attendant leaned forward, desperation creeping into her voice. "I wasn't trying to discriminate, it didn't feel right." The supervisor's eyes narrowed. "Do you realize how that sounds? Feelings are not part of your job description. You're here to follow protocol and treat every passenger with fairness and respect. That's it, nothing else." The flight attendant slumped back in her chair, her face pale. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The supervisor sighed, leaning back in her seat. "You're officially suspended pending further investigation. Corporate will handle the rest." The flight attendant felt her stomach drop. She had known this was a possibility, but hearing the words made it real. She opened her mouth to protest, but closed it again when she saw the unyielding look on the supervisor's face. There was nothing more to say. As the supervisor stood to leave, she paused at the door. "I suggest you prepare yourself," she said. "This isn't going to end quietly without another word." She left, leaving the flight attendant alone with the weight of her actions and their rapidly escalating consequences. At 300:00 FT, the couple exchanged another look, the man giving a slight nod as the woman reached for her phone with a calm expression. She sent a message. Her actions, as composed as they had been all day, showed that the wheels were already in motion, and the consequences for what had happened were far from over. The plane cruised steadily at 300:00 FT, but the atmosphere inside the cabin felt anything but routine. Conversations among passengers in first class were quieter than usual, with some stealing glances at the couple and others texting or whispering their thoughts about the earlier incident. The couple, however, maintained their calm, projecting an unshakable sense of control. It wasn't arrogance, it was focus. They knew the flight was just the beginning of what was unfolding. The man shifted slightly in his seat, glancing at his phone. A new notification appeared and his lips pressed together in a thoughtful expression. "It's spreading," he murmured softly to the woman. She leaned close, her eyes scanning the screen. The video of their interaction at the gate had already gained thousands of views and was being shared widely. Comments poured in, condemning the airline and praising the couple's grace under pressure. Some users were tagging news outlets, while others directed their outrage at the airline's official social media accounts, demanding accountability. The woman sat back, her expression calm but resolute. "This isn't about us anymore," she said quietly. "It's bigger than that." The man nodded. "We must make sure it leads to something meaningful," he replied, his tone firm. He placed his phone down and glanced toward the aisle, where a flight attendant was making her way toward them, her face uncertain. She stopped at their row, holding a tray with 2 glasses of sparkling water, compliments of the airline. "We want to apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced," she said, her voice polite but strained. The couple exchanged a brief look before the man took the glasses with a nod. "Thank you," he said, simply, his tone even. The woman didn't respond. Her focus drifted back to the window as she gazed at the clouds outside. The flight attendant hesitated, as though expecting more, but when it was clear the conversation was over, she turned and walked away in the back of the plane. The ripple effects of the incident were just as evident. Passengers and economy travelers, many of whom had also witnessed the scene at the gate, were buzzing quietly among themselves. One woman leaned toward her seatmate. "Did you see what happened earlier?" she whispered. "That couple didn't do anything wrong, it was so obvious." Her seatmate nodded. "I heard someone say they have a strong presence online. If that's true, this could be bad for the airline, real bad." Meanwhile, back on the ground, the fallout was already spiraling out of control. Inside the airline's corporate office, the communications team was in full crisis mode. Monitors on the wall displayed social media feeds filled with angry posts. One video, captioned, "Couple humiliated at the gate, discrimination in plain sight," had surpassed 1,000,000 views in less than an hour. A few high-profile figures had shared it, further amplifying its reach. The CEO, James Whitman, sat at the head of a long conference table, his face tight with frustration as he reviewed the updates. "What's the current status of the employee involved?" he asked sharply. "Suspended," replied the head of operations, flipping through a stack of papers. "She's been removed from duty pending investigation, and the passengers, they're on the flight now," another executive chimed in. "But we've received multiple complaints from other passengers who witnessed the incident. The situation is escalating." "Sir," Whitman rubbed his temples, "I want a full report by the time that flight lands," he said, "including all witness accounts and footage we can gather. We need to control the narrative before this blows up any further." At the airport, the suspended flight attendant sat in silence, her mind swirling with panic. Her phone vibrated again, but she couldn't bring herself to pick it up. She already knew what awaited her. Messages from colleagues asking what had happened. Notifications from social media posts tagging her name and updates. She didn't want to see her career, once a source of pride, now feeling like it was hanging by a thread. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if she had made a mistake. A real, irreversible mistake. The plane began its descent, the captain's voice coming over the intercom with routine instructions. The couple fastened their seatbelts, their expressions still unreadable. The woman glanced at her phone one last time before slipping it into her bag as the aircraft touched down smoothly on the runway. She exchanged a brief glance with the man without saying a word. They both knew the next steps were already in place. Back at the gate, airline representatives gathered near the jet bridge, their faces tight with tension. The CEO had made it clear that the couple was to be treated with the utmost care upon landing. A senior manager stood at the front, rehearsing what he would say. "We deeply regret the incident," he murmured under his breath, imagining the couple's response behind him. Other staff members shifted nervously, fully aware that this was no ordinary arrival. The doors to the plane opened and passengers began filing out, most of them glancing back at the couple seated in first class. The woman remained seated, her posture relaxed as she waited. The man stood, retrieving their carry-on bags and placing them neatly in the aisle. When they finally exited the plane, the senior manager stepped forward immediately, his expression composed but nervous. "Welcome," he said, extending a hand. "We're here to assist with anything you need." The man shook his hand but said nothing. The woman glanced at the group of employees, her expression calm but sharp. "We'll speak soon," she said quietly, her tone leaving no room for argument. The group parted as they walked past, leaving the staff to exchange uneasy glances. The couple's silence was more powerful than any outburst could have been. As they exited the terminal, the man checked his phone. A small smile crossed his lips. "The CEO wants a meeting," he said. The woman nodded, her expression unchanged. "Good," she replied. "Let's make sure this counts." The couple left the airport with the same calm composure they had maintained since the incident began. A black sedan waited for them just outside the terminal, and the driver, a middle-aged man with a professional demeanor, greeted them with a slight nod as he opened the door. They slid into the back seat without a word, their focus now shifting to what lay ahead inside the car. The man pulled out his phone and began typing. Notifications flooded the screen, news outlets requesting interviews, advocacy groups expressing support, and countless strangers applauding their grace under pressure. He forwarded a few key messages to the woman, who read them in silence before responding to one in particular. The airline CEO had requested an urgent meeting, emphasizing his desire to address the situation personally. "He's trying to get ahead of this," she said quietly, her tone measured. The man nodded. He knew the longer this stayed in the public eye, the worse it would get. "They'll want to frame this as a one-time mistake, not a systemic issue," he said, leaning back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. "We need to make sure it doesn't get brushed aside." The woman agreed with a small nod. "This isn't about apologies," she said. "It's about accountability." As their car moved through the city streets, the ripple effects of their experience continued to unfold. At the airline's corporate headquarters, a crisis management team was huddled in a glass-walled conference room. A large monitor displayed a real-time social media dashboard, the screen dominated by posts and comments about the incident. Some were furious, calling for a boycott of the airline. Others were sympathetic, sharing their own stories of discrimination while praising the couple for their restraint and dignity. A handful of high-profile figures had weighed in, amplifying the controversy and ensuring it wouldn't disappear quietly. The CEO, James Whitman, stood at the head of a long conference table, his face lined with frustration as he reviewed the latest updates. "How long do we have until the media picks this up?" he asked sharply. "They're already drafting stories," replied the head of communications. "A few outlets have requested statements from us. We've issued the standard acknowledgement and promise of investigation, but it's not going to hold off the backlash for long." Then the CEO asked, "Have we confirmed the meeting?" His assistant nodded. "They've agreed to meet this afternoon at our office. They made it clear they're looking for more than just an apology." James Whitman's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Good. We'll give them more. I want this resolved today." Back at the airport, the flight attendant who had sparked the controversy was spiraling further into panic. Her suspension had been formalized, and she had been asked to leave the premises until further notice. As she walked through the terminal toward the step-off exit, she could feel the stares of other employees and passengers alike. The whispers followed her, though no one dared to speak to her directly. Her phone vibrated again in her bag, and she finally mustered the courage to check it. The notifications were relentless. Mentions of her name in angry tweets, clips of the video that were now being circulated by major media outlets. and messages from people she didn't know, some supportive, most critical. Her stomach turned as she scrolled through the feed. Every post felt like another nail in the coffin of her career. For the first time, she began to realize the depth of her mistake. She had thought she was following her instincts, but now those same instincts had left her completely exposed. In the car, the couple arrived at their destination, a sleek office building in the heart of the city. They stepped out and thanked the driver, and entered the lobby, where an assistant from the CEO's office was waiting for them. She looked nervous, but professional as she greeted them. "Mr. Whitman is on his way," she said. "He's eager to address your concerns personally." The man and woman exchanged a brief glance before following her to a private conference room. It was quiet and minimalist, with large windows that offered a view of the bustling city below. The assistant offered them water, which they declined, before stepping out to give them privacy. They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, James Whitman entered, his polished demeanor doing little to conceal the tension in his movements. He extended a hand to each of them, his tone calm but earnest. "Thank you for agreeing to meet on such short notice," he said. "I want to start by offering my deepest apologies for what happened today. It was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for the actions of my staff." The man nodded but didn't speak. The woman leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "We appreciate the apology," she said, her voice firm. "But as I'm sure you're aware, this isn't just about what happened to us. This is about the environment that allowed it to happen in the first place." James Whitman's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "You're absolutely right," he said. "That's why we're taking immediate steps to address the systemic issues within our organization. We've already begun reviewing our training program, and we're planning to implement mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all staff. Additionally, we're revising our policies to ensure incidents like this are handled appropriately in the future." The woman's expression didn't change. "Words are easy," she said. "We need to see action, clear timelines, measurable outcomes, and transparency about the changes you're making. Anything less is just damage control." Whitman nodded again, his face serious. "You have my word that this will not be swept under the rug. I'll personally oversee the implementation of these changes and provide regular updates on our progress. I want to work with you to ensure we get this right." The man spoke for the first time, his voice calm but firm. "We'll hold you to that," he said. "This isn't just about us, it's about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly because of assumption. If you're serious about fixing this, we'll support you, but if it's just talk..." He let the sentence hang, the unspoken threat clear. Whitman straightened his expression, resolute. "It's not just talk," he said. "You'll see." The couple exchanged another look before standing. "We'll be watching," the woman said simply. They left the room without another word, leaving Whitman standing alone, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. As they exited the building, the woman turned to the man. "Do you believe him?" she asked. He considered the question for a moment before replying, "We'll see. But if they don't follow through, we'll make sure the world knows," he said. As the couple walked out of the building and into the crisp afternoon air, they both knew the meeting had been just the beginning. The CEO's words had been carefully measured, but words alone wouldn't undo what had happened or ensure meaningful change. They got back into the waiting sedan, the door closing with a soft thud. The man pulled out his phone again, scrolling through the barrage of updates. "They're still talking about it," he said, his tone neutral but pointed. "This isn't going away anytime soon." The woman nodded, glancing at her own phone. News outlets had started picking up the story. Headlines like, "Flight attendant denies black couple boarding, viral video sparks outrage," dominated the trending sections. Several prominent figures had weighed in, calling for action not just from the airline but from the industry as a whole. Some users were sharing their own stories of discrimination, while others demanded justice for the couple. The woman's gaze lingered on one post that read, "This isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a system that's long overdue for change." She looked up from the screen, her voice steady but firm. "We need to make sure this doesn't fizzle out. If they're serious about fixing this, fine, but if they think they can just apologize and move on, they're wrong." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We have the momentum now," he said. "Let's make it count." Meanwhile, back at the airline's corporate office, James Whitman was already mobilizing his team. The meeting with the couple had been a wake-up call. Their calm yet firm demands had left no room for complacency, and he knew that if the airline didn't act quickly and decisively, the fallout would be catastrophic. "Here's what I need," Whitman said, addressing the executives gathered in the conference room. "I want a full review of our policies and training materials by the end of the week. We're implementing mandatory bias and sensitivity training immediately. Not just for flight attendants, but for every employee, top to bottom. And I want a public statement issued by tonight." The head of communications hesitated. "A statement is a good start," she said cautiously. "But if we don't back it up with real action, it'll only make things worse. People will see right through it." Whitman gave a curt nod. "That's why the action plan goes out with the statement. No vague promises, clear steps, clear timelines. And I want updates sent to the couple personally. We're not just fixing this for PR, this has to be real." As the team dispersed, Whitman lingered in the room, staring at the large monitor that displayed real-time social media activity. The backlash was relentless, and the video of the gate incident was still spreading. He had no choice but to act. His reputation and the future of the airline depended on it. Across town, the flight attendant at the center of the controversy sat alone in her apartment. The blinds were drawn and the only light came from her television, which was tuned to a news channel covering the story. She stared blankly at the screen, her chest tightening as the anchor recounted the events. The video of her interaction with the couple played again, her voice sharp and dismissive as she questioned their tickets. It was followed by a shot of the couple boarding the plane, calm and composed despite the obvious humiliation. The anchor's voice was clinical. "The airline has issued a preliminary apology and suspended the employee involved pending investigation. However, critics were calling for broader accountability, citing this incident as a symptom of systemic issues within the aviation industry." The flight attendant muted the television, unable to listen any longer. Her phone buzzed on the table, but she ignored it. She already knew what the messages would say. Some of her co-workers had reached out, some supportive, others cold. A few of her friends had called, but she hadn't answered. The shame and regret were too heavy, and she couldn't bear to face their questions. Deep down, she knew her actions had been wrong. She had acted on a snap judgment, and now her career and her life were unraveling. She opened her laptop hesitantly, logging into the airline's internal portal. Her suspension notice was there, along with instructions for a mandatory meeting with HR. The words on the screen felt final, like the closing chapter of a book she hadn't meant to write. She sat back staring at the ceiling, the weight of her choices pressing down on her as she grappled with the reality of her situation. Meanwhile, the couple was already planning their next steps. Back at their home, they spread out documents and notes on the kitchen table, discussing the broader implications of their experience. "It wasn't just about us anymore," the woman said firmly. "It was about addressing a system that had allowed incidents like this to persist. This can't just end with us." The man nodded, tapping a pen against the table. "We have to make it bigger than this one airline," he said. They'll make their changes, but what about the rest of the industry? What about the people who don't have cameras to document what happens to them? The woman leaned forward, her eyes intense. We start here, she said, pointing to the airline action plan. We hold them accountable step by step, and then we push for more. The man smiled faintly. They don't know what they've started, he said, his tone carrying a quiet determination. As the night deepened, the couple worked late into the evening, drafting emails, outlining strategies, and reaching out to contacts who could help amplify their cause. For them, the incident wasn't an ending. It was the start of something much bigger. And as the city lights sparkled outside their window, they knew the fight for change had only just begun. The morning sun rose on a city that was already buzzing with conversations about the airline incident. News outlets were now running full stories with headlines growing sharper and more damning. A major national morning show aired a segment featuring a panel of experts discussing discrimination in customer service industries. Clips of the gate interaction played again, juxtaposed with statistics about racial bias in public-facing professions. The hosts expressed their outrage, and by the end of the segment, the airline's name had become synonymous with the controversy. Back home, the couple watched the coverage in silence, their expressions unreadable. The woman sipped her coffee while scrolling through her phone, and the man typed on his laptop. This has traction, he said finally, looking up. We're getting messages from advocacy groups. They want to know how they can support us. The woman nodded. It's bigger than the airline now, she said. But that's what we wanted. She set her coffee cup down, her voice firm. Let's make sure they don't forget why this started. Their resolve was clear, but the ripple effects were being felt far beyond their home. At the airline's headquarters, the CEO's day had begun hours earlier with back-to-back meetings. James Whitman had always been a confident leader, but today he felt like he was trying to plug a sinking ship. Every time he addressed one issue, another seemed to surface. The PR team was overwhelmed, the operations team was scrambling to adjust training protocols, and the legal team had already warned of potential lawsuits if the couple decided to take things further. Whitman sat at the head of the table in the executive conference room, his face tight as he reviewed the draft of the public statement that was scheduled to be released later that day. The head of communications was speaking, but he barely registered her words. His mind was on the couple. Their calm but pointed demands in yesterday's meeting had stuck with him, and he knew their expectations were high. If the airline's response didn't meet those expectations, the fallout would be devastating. Sir, the communications lead said, pulling Whitman out of his thoughts, we need your approval to release this. He glanced down at the statement again, skimming it quickly. It was apologetic but vague, promising an investigation and steps toward improvement without committing to specifics. This isn't enough, he said flatly, pushing the document back across the table. They want action. We need to show them we're serious. The room fell silent. The operations director spoke hesitantly. What are you suggesting? I want a detailed action plan, Whitman said. Not just sensitivity training, a full review of how we handle passenger interactions, stricter protocols for decision-making, and consequences for staff who violate those protocols. And I want it published alongside the statement. The head of communications frowned. Publishing that much detail could open us up to more scrutiny, she said carefully. It could make us look like we're admitting fault. Whitman fixed her with a sharp look. We are at fault, he said. The only way out of this is to own it and fix it. Back in the flight attendant's apartment, the reality of those consequences was hitting home. She had spent the night scrolling through messages and social media posts, each one more damning than the last. Her name wasn't public yet, but it was only a matter of time. She had tried to draft an apology, but every time she started typing, the words felt hollow. What could she say that wouldn't sound like an excuse? Her thoughts were interrupted by an email notification. It was from the airline's HR department, requesting a formal meeting to discuss her suspension and the ongoing investigation. The email was professional, but the subtext was clear. Her future with the airline was hanging by a thread. She stared at the screen, her hands trembling. For years, she had prided herself on being a skilled and capable employee. Now that identity felt like it was crumbling around her. As the hours passed, the couple continued to work behind the scenes. They drafted an open letter addressed not just to the airline, but to the broader aviation industry, calling for systemic change in how passengers are treated. The letter outlined their demands: mandatory sensitivity training for all employees, transparent policies for handling complaints, and consequences for discriminatory behavior. They plan to publish it online and share it with the media. "This isn't about taking them down," the man said as they reviewed the draft. "It's about forcing them and others to do better." The woman nodded, her expression resolute. "People need to see that they can't get away with this anymore." By midday, the airline's public statement went live. It acknowledged the incident, apologized to the couple, and outlined the immediate steps being taken to address the issue. The statement included a commitment to implementing mandatory training and a promise of transparency in the investigation. Social media buzzed with reactions, some praising the airline for taking responsibility, others criticizing the response as too little too late. The couple read the statement carefully, their expressions remained neutral. "It's a start," the woman said finally, "but it's not enough." The man nodded. "Then we make sure they follow through," he said. He hit the publish button on their open letter, and within minutes, it began spreading online. Advocacy groups shared it widely, praising the couple for turning a negative experience into a call for change. The comments were overwhelmingly supportive, with people from all walks of life sharing their own stories of bias and discrimination. As the letter gained momentum, the airline's executives scrambled to respond. Whitman read the letter in his office, his jaw tightening. He knew the couple was right. The statement and initial measures weren't enough. Picking up the phone, he called his assistant. "Get him on the line," he said. "We need another meeting." The assistant hesitated. "Sir, they're already pushing forward with their letter. It's gone viral." Whitman exhaled heavily, his frustration evident. "Then we move faster. I want a meeting scheduled by the end of the day, no delays," he said. As the sun began to set, the couple sat back, watching as the letter they had written took on a life of its own. It wasn't about revenge or personal gain for them. It was about making sure no one else had to endure what they had. And as the world watched, it became clear that their quiet strength had sparked a movement far bigger than anyone had anticipated. In his office, late into the evening, the airline CEO sat staring at the open letter on his computer screen. The couple's demands were clear, pointed, and reasonable. They hadn't asked for money, nor had they made personal accusations. Instead, they had outlined systemic flaws and called for sweeping reforms. It wasn't just about the flight attendant or the single incident. It was about an entire culture that needed to change. Whitman knew this was no longer a matter of saving face. It was about the survival of the airline's reputation and integrity. He picked up the phone and dialed the number his assistant had provided. After a few rings, the man answered, his voice calm and measured. "This is Lucas," he said. and Mr. Carter Hayes began, keeping his tone professional. "I wanted to personally thank you for the open letter. It's clear, actionable, and well thought out. I'd like the opportunity to meet again and discuss how we can incorporate your suggestions into our reforms." There was a brief pause before Lucas replied. "We're willing to meet," he said, "but we're not interested in surface-level changes. If this meeting is just about optics, you can save your breath." Whitman sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I understand your skepticism," he admitted, "but I assure you this is about more than damage control. We want to make real changes. I want your input to make sure we get it right." Lucas exchanged a glance with his wife, who was seated across from him at their dining table. She nodded subtly, her expression guarded but approving. "We'll meet," Lucas said finally. "But this is your chance to prove you're serious. Don't waste it." The meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon at the couple's office. Whitman ended the call with a sense of relief, but also with the understanding that the real work was just beginning. At the same time, the airline's internal investigation was moving forward. The suspended flight attendant had been called in for an interview with HR, where she sat in a sterile conference room under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. Her palms were sweaty, and her voice wavered as she answered the investigator's questions. "I didn't mean to discriminate," she said defensively. "I was just trying to do my job." The HR representative, a composed woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, raised an eyebrow. "Your job is to follow protocol," she said. "According to the reports, their tickets were valid, their behavior was respectful, and there was no reason to deny them boarding. Can you explain why you questioned them?" The flight attendant hesitated, her throat dry. I thought there might have been a mistake," she said weakly. "Something about the situation didn't seem right." The HR representative's expression didn't change. "Your personal feelings about a situation are not grounds for action. Your decision caused a significant incident that has damaged the airline's reputation. We need to understand exactly why you made that decision." The flight attendant stammered, struggling to justify her actions. As the questions continued, she began to realize there was no satisfactory explanation. She had acted on an assumption, one rooted in bias, and now she was facing the consequences. By the end of the meeting, it was clear to her that her future with the airline was uncertain at best. Meanwhile, the couple prepared for their next meeting with Whitman. They had spent the day gathering more data and examples of systemic issues within the industry, determined to push for broader reforms. As they reviewed their materials, the woman leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "They're scrambling," she said. "They know this isn't just about one employee. If they don't fix this, the whole industry is going to feel the ripple effects." Lucas nodded. "Good," he said simply. "That's exactly what needs to happen." As the evening wore on, their letter continued to gain traction online. More stories poured in from passengers who had experienced similar treatment, their voices joining the growing chorus calling for change. Advocacy groups began to rally behind the couple, using the momentum to push for reforms across multiple industries. What had started as a single incident at a boarding gate was quickly becoming a movement. The airline's executives were acutely aware of this shift. Whitman called an emergency meeting with his senior team that night, outlining a plan to accelerate the reforms. "We can't afford to drag our feet," he said. "We need to act now, or this will define us forever." By the time the couple went to bed that night, they knew the tides were turning. They had started something bigger than themselves, and they were determined to see it through. For the first time since the incident, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet satisfaction. But they also knew the fight was far from over. Change would take time, persistence, and accountability, and they were ready to make sure it happened. The next day, the couple arrived at their office early, preparing for their meeting with James Whitman. The documents and notes they had worked on late into the night were neatly arranged on the conference table. The woman adjusted her blazer, her expression calm but firm. Lucas glanced at the clock. "They'll be here soon," he said quietly. A few minutes later, Whitman arrived with 2 senior executives in tow, his demeanor composed but the weight of the situation clear in his posture. He extended a hand as he entered the room. "Thank you for meeting with us again," he said. "We appreciate the opportunity to continue this conversation." The woman gestured to the table, inviting them to sit. "Let's get started," she said simply. There was no small talk, no pleasantries. The tone of the room was professional but serious. Whitman began by outlining the airline's immediate actions and response to the incident. "We've already implemented mandatory sensitivity training for all employees," he said. "That includes flight attendants, gate agents, and even senior leadership. We're also revising our protocols to ensure that decisions like these are made based on clear, objective criteria, not personal judgment." Lucas nodded but didn't respond. The woman leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "That's a start, but training alone won't fix this. You need accountability. What happens when an employee violates these protocols? What steps are being taken to ensure there are consequences?" Whitman exchanged a glance with his team before responding. "We're introducing a tiered system for accountability," he said. "Violations will result in immediate reviews, and repeat offenses will lead to termination. We're also establishing a new reporting system so that incidents like this can be flagged and addressed quickly." Lucas leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful, and asked, "What about the passengers? What systems are in place to ensure they have a voice when these incidents happen?" The head of operations spoke up. "We're expanding our passenger feedback channels and making them more accessible," she continued. "We're also committing to greater transparency about how complaints are handled. Every complaint will be reviewed by an independent panel, and passengers will be kept informed throughout the process." The couple exchanged a glance, silently weighing the response. Finally, the woman spoke again. "That's more comprehensive." She paused before adding, "But what about systemic issues? These changes address this airline, but the problem goes beyond your company. Are you willing to push for broader reforms in the industry?" Whitman hesitated for a moment before nodding. "We are," he said. "This incident has shown us that there's work to be done not just here, but across the entire industry. We're already in discussions with other airlines about creating a coalition to address these issues on a larger scale." The woman studied him carefully, her gaze wavering. "We'll hold you to that," she said. "This can't just be about damage control. It has to lead to real change." Whitman nodded, his expression serious. "You have my word," he said. "We're committed to making this right." The meeting continued for over an hour, with the couple outlining additional recommendations and the airline's team taking notes. By the end, there was a clear framework in place for the changes to come. As Whitman and his team stood to leave, he extended his hand again. "Thank you for holding us accountable," he said. "Your voice has been invaluable." "This isn't about us," he said. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." After the airline's team left, the couple sat quietly in the conference room, reflecting on the meeting. "Do you think they'll follow through?" Lucas asked. The woman took a deep breath. "We'll make sure they do," she said firmly. "And if they don't, we won't let them off the hook." Across the city, the airline was already releasing updates to the public. A new statement detailed the steps they were taking, including the implementation of the changes discussed in the meeting. While some praised the airline's transparency, Others remained skeptical, waiting to see if the promises would be kept. Meanwhile, the flight attendant was grappling with the fallout of her actions. She had been informed that her suspension would become permanent and that her termination was being finalized. She had spent the day drafting a letter of apology, not to save her job but to express her regret. That afternoon, the couple received the letter via email. It was short and direct, acknowledging the harm caused by her actions and expressing a commitment to reflection and growth. The woman read it carefully before setting it aside. "It doesn't change what happened," she said, "but at least she's taking responsibility." Lucas nodded. "It's a step," he said. "Now let's see if the airline does the same." As the day ended, the couple returned home, exhausted but resolute. Their once isolated struggle had blossomed into a formidable movement. Every day they witnessed more people rally behind their cause, a tangible sign that change was no longer a distant dream, but an emerging reality. Their open letter, echoing the need for systemic reform, was shared across social media, championed by advocacy groups, industry experts, and everyday citizens alike. News outlets followed up with detailed reports on the airline's pledged reforms, scrutinizing timelines and demanding genuine accountability. The couple immersed themselves in discussions with stakeholders, ensuring that the promises made were not lost in bureaucratic delays, and lending their voices to a broader call for fairness across industries. Within the airline, CEO James Whitman had risked his personal credibility to drive these changes. Internal memos soon circulated a bold new vision. Mandatory training sessions for flight attendants, gate agents, and other staff were introduced, emphasizing professionalism, empathy, and an unwavering commitment to equitable treatment. Regular updates via the airline's social media channels offered a transparent window into the progress being made. Each post a reassurance that the old ways were giving way to a culture of accountability and respect. Meanwhile, the suspended flight attendant found herself on the other side of the transformation. Officially terminated, she observed from afar as the airline implemented its promised reforms. Her personal and professional life had been irrevocably altered by the incident, and though the initial public outrage had subsided, the weight of her actions lingered. Determined not to let her mistake define her, she began a personal journey of redemption, a quest to understand and address the unconscious biases that had played a role in her decision-making. She had joined a local organization focused on educating people about unconscious bias, sharing her story as an example of how quick judgments could lead to lasting harm. Months later, the airline invited the couple to attend a formal announcement of their newly implemented policies. The event unfolded in the grand atrium of a bustling international airport, where media, airline employees, and members of the public gathered in anticipation. At the center of it all, CEO James Whitman took the stage. With poised authority, he detailed the sweeping measures the airline had adopted, unveiling initiatives aimed at setting a new, higher benchmark for the entire industry. When he then invited the couple to speak, the room fell into a profound hush. The woman stepped forward first, her voice calm and steady as she addressed the attentive crowd. "This isn't just about one incident," she declared, her tone imbued with resolve. "It's about a system that allowed it to happen and the responsibility we all share in changing that system." Her words resonated deeply, stirring a collective sense of accountability among those listening. Lucas followed, his voice measured yet firm. "We didn't start this to punish anyone. We started this because we believe things can be better for everyone, and now it's up to all of us to make sure these changes stick." His statement cut through the silence, and the audience responded with a heartfelt round of applause. But for the couple, the sound of clapping was secondary to the impact of their message, a powerful reminder that their experience had ignited a broader movement for justice. After the ceremony, as the echoes of applause dwindled, they paused by a panoramic window overlooking the airfield. There, planes soared gracefully against the sky, symbolizing both departure and new beginnings. The woman turned to Lucas, her eyes reflecting both relief and determination. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. Lucas met her gaze, his expression resolute as he affirmed, "We've started something they can't ignore." Their journey had transformed a deeply personal injustice into a catalyst for widespread accountability, reform, and the promise that no one else should ever face what they had endured. Together they walked toward the exit, ready to keep pushing forward, knowing that the changes they had fought for were already taking flight. From this story, we learn the importance of following fair and professional guidelines when dealing with customers. When decisions are based on personal feelings or biases rather than objective procedures, it not only harms the individuals involved, but also tarnishes the reputation of the organization. This incident shows that discrimination based on personal instincts can quickly spiral out of control, leading to widespread public backlash and a loss of trust among customers. It underscores the need for thorough training on unconscious bias and the establishment of clear, transparent policies within the workplace. Moreover, the power of social media plays a crucial role in holding leaders accountable, as public pressure forces companies to implement real changes rather than superficial fixes. This event became a catalyst for reform not only within the airline but across the entire industry, inspiring many to demand better treatment and systemic change. Ultimately, the story serves as a stark reminder that every action has consequences, and organizations must prioritize fairness and accountability to maintain public trust and ensure sustainable success. Change begins with responsible, ethical leadership today. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.